Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Because by the end of this story, you're going to feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Because would you believe a dog could run into a house completely, swallowed by fire, disappear into the flames, and come back out carrying something so unbelievable it left firefighters speechless? A mother sobbing, and an entire town shaken with gratitude, and the only reason any of it happened was because of what that dog had seen weeks before, while no one else was paying attention. And it all began in the quiet outer hills of Vermont, where pine trees grow tall enough to shadow memories, and where snow in December hushes the world like a blanket over a sleeping child. And in that small, forgotten town, with no stoplights and one diner that still serves grilled cheese for $1.75, there lived a single mother named Grace and her 7-year-old daughter Sophie, who had a giggle that could make tired people smile and a favorite teddy bear that had lost one ear but not an ounce of love. And they lived in a crooked wooden house, just off the edge of Everpeen Road, the kind of home that looked like it had stories of its own. Stories etched into the creaking floorboards and the tilted front steps and the small attic window that Sophie believed was magical. And they weren't. Rich, not by any stretch. In fact, Grace worked 3 part-time jobs just to keep the lights on and the soup warm. But there was love in that house. Real love. The kind you can't fake or buy. The kind that wraps around you when the world gets cold. And every evening, no matter how tired Grace was, she and Sophie would sit on the old green couch by the fireplace, sharing stories, brushing doll hair, reading books, until Sophie's eyes blinked slower and the fire dimmed into sleepy orange shadows on the wall. And when Sophie was finally asleep, Grace would sit alone, looking at old photos of her late husband Jack, who had passed away when Sophie was only 2, and whisper to the room, "We're doing okay, aren't we?" And though no one ever answered, something in her heart always said yes, and it was during one of those quiet nights, just before Christmas, when everything changed. Because that was the night the dog appeared, not with barks or howls, but in silence, just standing there at the edge of their snowy porch, looking in through the window like he was searching for something. He was big, a German shepherd with fur that looked like old burnished gold, eyes that carried something deeper than instinct, something that felt like memory. And when Grace opened the door, he didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked at her like he already knew her. And Sophie, still wide awake in her pajamas, gasped, with the kind of joy only children have, ran to the door and shouted, "Mommy, he found us!" As if he wasn't a stranger, but a friend returning from a long journey in Grace. Uncertain but trusting her daughter's joy, stepped aside, and the dog walked in, carefully. Like he respected the space, like he knew homes were sacred, and from that moment on, he became part of their life, without collar, without a name, just there, always watching Sophie eat her cereal, sitting by the fireplace as Grace folded laundry, waiting outside the bathroom door during bath time, like a sentinel. And Grace would sometimes whisper to him when Sophie was asleep, things she couldn't say to anyone else, things like, "I miss him more at night, and I hope I'm enough." And though the dog never made a sound, his eyes said everything she needed to hear. And so they gave him a name, not something grand or clever, just Bear, because that was what Sophie said he looked like when he curled up at the foot of her bed. Big and warm and protective, and it suited him, because Bear didn't act like a normal dog, didn't chase his tail or beg for scraps, didn't bark at mailmen or squirrels. Instead, he listened, always listened, and sometimes Grace would catch him staring at Sophie with this kind of quiet intensity. Not scary, not strange, but like he was memorizing her. It's like he knew something no one else did. And maybe he did, because over the weeks, small things began to happen. Flickering lights, a strange smell in the hallway, cold drafts from the attic. And while Grace thought it was just the old house settling into winter, Bear seemed uneasy, sitting longer near the walls, sniffing beneath the floorboards, staring at the fireplace with eyes that flicked toward the ceiling. And one night, when the wind was especially cruel and the chimney howled like a sad song, Bear growled, low and steady, not at anything seen, but at something felt. And Grace held Sophie tighter, whispering, "It's just the wind." But Bear didn't stop growling until dawn, and that morning, Grace called a local handyman to inspect the furnace and wiring, just to be safe, but the man shrugged and said, "Old houses make old noises, that's all," and walked away. With a half-hearted chuckle, but Bear didn't laugh. Bear stayed close to Sophie every second, walking her to the mailbox, sitting outside the bathroom while she brushed her teeth, following her from room to room like her shadow had grown legs. And though Grace started to notice, started to worry, she didn't know what to do, didn't know how to explain a fear that hadn't happened yet. And so life went on. Snow kept falling, songs played from radios. Cookies were baked and burned and eaten anyway, and one Friday night, just 2 days before Christmas, Sophie placed her teddy bear on the window ledge and whispered, "You watch the stars tonight, okay? I want you to see Santa when he flies." Bye, and Grace smiled and kissed her forehead and tucked her in, never knowing that those would be the last quiet words spoken in that house before the fire came. It started with a sound so soft that even the snow outside seemed louder, just a faint, almost invisible crackle beneath the floorboards. A whisper of heat where cold should have lived, and Bear heard it before anyone else did, lifting his head. From the carpet at exactly 2:17 a.m., eyes snapping open, ears tilting forward, his entire body still but electric, like every cell inside him had been set to alert. And for a moment he'd just listened, perfectly motionless. While the orange firelight flickered quietly in the fireplace, the wind tapped lightly against the windows like fingers trying to wake the world, and upstairs, Sophie breathed softly in her sleep, her arm wrapped around the teddy bear on the windowsill, her dreams still full of cookies and snow angels and reindeer that flew. But Bear heard something different, something behind the walls, something that didn't belong. And as Grace turned in her sleep downstairs, curling tighter, beneath the patchwork blanket she always used when the furnace was lazy, Bear rose slowly, stepping off the rug with a careful stillness, his paws soundless against the wood, his nose already picking up the faintest edge of burning, not like the familiar scent of firewood or melting wax, but harsher, metallic, something deep and electrical, something living inside the bones of the house. And as he padded through the living room, past the bookshelf with its tilted frames, past the dried pine wreath hanging on the wall, he stopped near the base of the staircase and stared at the vent, watching as a thin, unfamiliar haze began to snake from it like a ghost trying to find a voice. And Bear growled, low and rumbling, the kind of sound that isn't made for threats, but for warnings. And when Grace stirred again upstairs, he barked once, sharp and loud, and then again louder, more urgent. And Grace sat up straight in bed, heart pounding, because Bear never barked at night, never made noise unless something was wrong. The moment she stood, she smelled its smoke, not thick yet, but wrong, curling up from the floor vents like it had been hiding there all along. And before she could even reach the doorknob, she heard Bear's paws thudding against the stairs, fast now, urgent. And she opened the bedroom door just as the smoke alarms shrieked into the air, and everything moved too fast and too slow all at once, her hands grabbing Sophie's blanket, her voice shaking Sophie awake, Sophie coughing before she could speak. The room already blurry with fog and panic, and Bear was there in the hallway, barking, turning, barking again, and they followed him, coughing, eyes stinging, Grace rapping, Sophie in the blanket, barefoot against the cold wooden floor. And as they reached the stairs, they saw it, the bottom floor glowing orange, not with firelight from the fireplace, but from something bigger, something alive and growing, flames licking up the walls like fingers hungry for oxygen, smoke thick and curling along the ceiling, like a ceiling of ash. And Grace froze for a second, her brain trying to catch up, trying to calculate a route through the chaos. But Bear didn't hesitate. He ran ahead, carving a path through the smoke, barking, pausing, turning, as if to say, follow me now." And they did, moving like ghosts themselves through the smoke. Past the kitchen where the wallpaper, peeled and curled from the heat, past the living room where the fire now roared in defiance. And just as Grace shoved the front door open with her shoulder, the blast of cold air hit her like a slap, snowflakes dancing in and dying on the rising heat. And she turned to check Sophie, her little girl sobbing now but breathing. "Ow, and Bear behind her eyes wild, fur smoking at the edges, and they tumbled out into the snow, coughing and crying. The house behind them crackling like an angry forest. And for a moment, just one moment, they stood in silence, Grace holding Sophie, both shaking, eyes wide as they watched the flames burst through the windows upstairs. The attic glowing like a lantern, and Bear pacing, not sitting, not resting, but looking back at the house like he wasn't done, like something was still missing. And that's when Sophie screamed, "Teddy!" And Grace looked down at her, confused, until she saw the look in her daughter's eyes, pure terror. Not for herself, not for the house, but for the one thing she had left on the windowsill upstairs. The one thing she had told to watch for. Santa, the teddy bear, with one ear that had been with her since the hospital. And Grace knelt beside her, brushing hair from her face, whispering, "It's okay, baby. We'll get another one. It's okay." But Sophie shook her head violently, sobbing, "No, no, no." And Bear, who had been pacing, stopped, ears flicking toward Sophie's voice, head tilting, and in that instant, everything changed. Because he looked at the house, then at Sophie, then at Grace, and Grace saw it in his eyes, that moment of decision, that lightning flash of courage that doesn't ask for permission. And before she could stop him, before she could even scream his name, Bear turned and ran, straight into the fire, through the broken front door, through the rising smoke and the collapsing heat, disappearing into the very heart of the house they had just escaped, and Grace screamed, "No!" But he was gone, just like that, swallowed whole by the home he had guarded. Out, and time broke, shattered into 1,000 pieces, every second suddenly a minute, every breath a prayer, Sophie screaming for Bear, Grace pulling her close, her own voice lost to the wind, and sirens now howling in the distance, and the snow kept falling, tiny flakes landing on the roof, melting into nothing. And the fire roared louder, the upstairs windows bursting, flames shooting out like dragon breath. And still no sign of him, no sound, no bark. Nothing but smoke and flame and the impossible wait, and Grace whispered, "Please, God, please." Over and over again, not for the house, not even for the teddy bear, but for him. For the dog who had appeared like a gift and loved them like he had always belonged. And in that moment, every memory of him played through her mind, his quiet eyes, his warmth against her feet, the way he watched Sophie like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. And suddenly a shadow moved in the fire, a shape in the doorway, and Grace gasped, pulling Sophie behind her, her eyes locked on the smoke, and then she saw him, Bear, leaping through the orange light, fur scorched at the tips, one paw limping slightly, but eyes bright and alive. And in his mouth, clutched gently between his teeth, was something small and brown. A teddy bear, wet from his mouth, singed at the seams, but whole. And as he landed in the snow, Grace and Sophie fell to their knees, arms wrapping around him, both sobbing, and Bear collapsed gently into their laps, tail wagging once, twice, before going still, not because he was hurt, but because he had done what he came to do. And as firefighters surrounded them, shouting orders and spraying hoses, the three of them sat in the snow, a mother, a daughter, and a dog who had just run into a burning house and come back with something no one believed he could, not just a stuffed animal, but hope, memory, love, and the kind of loyalty that lives in silence, acts without asking, and teaches us all what it means to stay. If you've ever witnessed a miracle, not the kind written in books or preached in quiet chapels, but the kind that unfolds in snow-covered driveways under the glow of a burning house, then you know there's a kind of silence that follows, not absence, but reverence. The way the world pauses to catch its breath because something sacred just happened. And that's what surrounded them as Bear lay curled in the snow, steam rising off his coat, his sides rising and falling slow but steady. The half-burned teddy bear still clutched between his teeth like a flag of love, and Grace didn't move at first, afraid that if she did, the moment would end. And Sophie, her cheeks streaked with tears and ash, reached forward and touched his fur, whispering his name over and over, "Bear, Bear, Bear," until his eyes fluttered open, Just for a second, just long enough to meet hers. And then closed again with the kind of peace that said, "You're safe, and that's all that matters." And by then, the firefighters had surrounded them, not shouting, not hurrying, just standing there with stunned expressions because they'd seen rescues, they'd seen pets pulled from basements, but they'd never seen anything like this. A dog choosing to run into fire, not out of fear, not by accident, but on purpose, with intent, with heart, and the fire chief. A man named Howard, with 28 years of service and eyes that rarely softened, knelt beside Bear and removed his helmet, whispering, "My God." He brought it back, and Grace, still shaking, nodded and handed him the teddy bear, still wet but whole, and said it was her favorite. It was the last thing left of her dad, and in that moment something shifted, not just for the people there, but for the town. Because the story spread faster than the flames ever could, first to the paramedics who gently lifted Bear onto a stretcher and wrapped him in warm blankets while Sophie insisted on holding his paw. Then to the ER doctor who cleared an entire bay just for him and stitched the burns on his legs with the same care he'd give a child. And finally to the vet who drove through the night in snow just to sit beside him, whispering things no one else could hear. Things like, "You did it, boy. You did something we'll never forget." And Bear, even in sleep, seemed to hear it. Because his ears twitched, and when Sophie walked into the clinic the next morning, holding a hand-drawn card that said, "Thank you for saving Teddy. Thank you for saving me," Bear opened his eyes again. Just long enough to wag his tail. Just once, and the vet smiled and said, "That's not for you, that's for her." And over the next few days, the town became something it hadn't been in years, connected, awake, alive with purpose, because in a place where people had learned to pass each other by, now they stopped, asked questions, dropped off dog treats and blankets at the vet's door, and offered money, donations, prayers, anything they could to help the family who had lost everything except each other, and Bear, who had never asked for anything, came the heart of it all. The silent hero who had carried more than just a teddy bear out of that house. He had carried a whole town's belief in love, in sacrifice, in the idea that maybe we aren't as alone as we think we are. And Grace, still staying in a temporary apartment offered by a kind couple from church, began keeping a journal just to process it all. And on the third night after the fire, she wrote something she hadn't said aloud in years: "I believe in goodness again." And when she showed it to Sophie, Sophie added, "Because of." Bear and Grace nodded, wiping tears from her face. And as they visited him each day, bringing him scrambled eggs and socks that smelled like home, Bear began to heal, slowly, the burns fading, the limp easing, and though the vet warned that he might never be the same, Grace smiled and said, "He doesn't need to be the same. He just needs to know we love him." And Bear, lying on the soft cushion the vet had placed beside the heater, wagged his tail again, this time twice. And the local newspaper ran a front-page article with the headline, "Dog Braves Fire Too. Save Family and a Memory." And inside the article, the reporter included a quote from Sophie that read, "He didn't just save my bear, he saved my heart." And across town, people began leaving stuffed animals on their porches with notes tied to them that said "For Bear." And school kids wrote essays titled, "Why Dogs Are Angels." And even old Mr. Jenkins, who had never spoken to anyone in 10 years, left a can of dog food on the vet's porch with a note that said, "He reminds me of one I lost." And the story reached further than anyone expected, picked up by online blogs, local news stations, and finally a morning show producer from New York who called Grace personally and asked if they would come to the city to share the story. Grace, still shaken, politely declined, saying, "He doesn't need to be on TV. He just needs to be home." And when the vet finally cleared Bear to leave, the entire neighborhood gathered outside the clinic, lining the sidewalks with candles and posters, cheering as Bear stepped out with Grace on one side and Sophie on the other, walking slowly but proudly. And Sophie leaned down and whispered, "You're my hero, Bear." And he looked up at her like he already knew that, like he had always known. And as they walked home to a new apartment full of warmth and temporary furniture and a new fireplace that crackled without threat, Bear curled up in the corner, resting his head on the very same teddy bear he had saved, now stitched up and clean. And Grace sat beside him and said, "I hope you know what you've done." And even though he didn't speak, didn't move, something in his breathing said, "Yes, yes I do." And later that night, Sophie asked, "Do you think Dad knows what happened?" And Grace, holding back tears, whispered, "I think he does." I think Bear made sure of that, and they both sat quietly, listening to the fire. Not the one that burned houses, but the one that warmed hearts. And in that silence, in that peace, the story of the dog who ran into a burning house became something more than just a story. It became a memory stitched into the fabric of every person who had heard it. A lesson in love, in bravery, in what it means to carry someone else's heart out of the fire and into the light. The thing about time is that it doesn't stop for anyone. Not for grief, not for healing, not even for heroes. And in the months that followed the fire, life in the little town on the edge of Vermont did what it always does. It kept moving. But it moved differently, slower in some places, softer in others. Because the story of the dog who ran into a burning house wasn't just a moment. It was a ripple, one that kept spreading out in gentle waves, touching people who had never even met Grace or Sophie or Bear, and yet somehow they felt like they knew them. Like the story had reached into their own memories and reminded them of something they'd forgotten. Maybe a dog from childhood. Maybe a moment when someone stayed when they didn't have to. And so life resumed. Yes, but not in the same way. Not after Bear. Because in the days after he returned home from the vet, wrapped in warm blankets and carrying just a little bit of a limp, things began to change all around him. Neighbors dropped by with food and toys, not just for Bear, but for Sophie, offering books and puzzles and paint sets to replace the ones lost in the fire. And every single visitor, no matter how brief their stay, made their way to the corner of the living room where Bear now slept each afternoon, gently placing a hand on his fur, whispering words like "thank you" and "you're amazing," and sometimes just "I remember." And Bear, always quiet, always still, seemed to take it in, his eyes blinking slowly, his tail thumping gently against the floor. And over time, Sophie's school got involved too, launching a reading program called Bravery with Bear, where students would sit beside him one by one and read their favorite books aloud. Believing that if Bear could be brave enough to face fire, then maybe they could be brave enough to read out loud in front of others. And the results were nothing short of magic. Shy children began speaking louder. Anxious kids smiled more. And one boy who had refused to read for 6 months suddenly sat beside Bear and read 2 whole chapters from Charlotte's Web, pausing only once to rub Bear's ears and say, "You listen better than people." And Bear listened, always listened. His presence steady and healing, like a warm coat wrapped around cold shoulders. And teachers began sending home letters to parents saying, "Something is different in the best way." And word spread to other schools, other towns, and soon, Bear's schedule included quiet visits to nursing homes, libraries, and even a local grief support group where children who had lost siblings or parents would sit in a circle, holding stuffed animals while Bear walked among them, laying his head gently on their laps. And if you didn't believe in the healing power of animals before, you did now, because there was something in the way Bear moved. Slowly, deliberately, always choosing who needed him most in the room, without being told, without being asked. And Grace sometimes said, "He has Jack's soul in him. I just know it." And Sophie would nod, because even though she didn't fully understand what souls were, she understood Bear, and that was enough. And as spring melted into summer, and the trees grew heavy with leaves again, Grace found herself smiling more, laughing even, sometimes catching her reflection in the mirror and barely recognizing the light returning to her own eyes. And every night when Sophie crawled into bed, she'd whisper, "Good night, Bear," through the cracked door, and Bear would thump his tail once from his corner before drifting off to sleep. And it felt like their family, broken for so long, had somehow stitched itself back together, not perfectly, not without scars, but stronger where the seams had been torn. And then came The day that changed everything again, not with fire this time, but with a different kind of heat, the kind that comes from memories, from looking back. Because it was the 1-year anniversary of the fire, and Grace woke up early, heart tight in her chest, unsure how to move through the day, unsure what to say to Sophie. But when she came downstairs, she found her daughter already dressed, holding the old teddy bear that Bear had saved, with a tiny stitched heart on its chest and a new name tag that simply read Hope. And Sophie said, "I want to take him back." Just for a minute. And Grace didn't need to ask where. She knew. And so they drove slowly, Bear in the back seat, staring out the window at the fields passing by, until they reached the lot where their old house had stood, now just flat grass and the start of a foundation for a new home being built by volunteers. And they stood there in the morning light, the three of them, holding hands, no words needed. And Sophie placed the bear gently on the earth, whispering, "Thank you for watching." And Bear stepped forward, touched the bear with his nose, then looked up at the sky. And Grace swore in that moment she felt something in the air shift, like a breath being held had finally been released. And from then on, time moved again, faster now. But with joy, real joy, and life unfolded in small, beautiful ways, pancakes. On Sunday mornings, new books read in Bear's corner. Sophie's first sleepover at a friend's house, and Bear, growing older now, moved a little slower, took longer naps, and sometimes stared at the fire with a distant look in his eyes, like he was remembering something only he could see. And Grace watched him, her heart aching with gratitude and the growing awareness that time, even when sweet, always moves forward. And so she took more pictures, longer videos, letting Sophie record Bear's snoring, Bear's tail wags, Bear's sneezes after sniffing wildflowers. And one evening, after tucking Sophie in, Grace sat beside him and whispered, "I don't know how we'll say goodbye." And Bear blinked slowly, gently, resting his head on her knee, and it felt like he was saying, "You won't have to. I'll still be here." And she believed him, not because of words, but because of presence. Because Bear had shown her that love doesn't always need to speak to be heard. And as the stars came out and the wind moved softly through the window, Grace leaned her head against the couch, eyes closed, holding Bear's paw in her hand, and whispered, "Just stay as long as you can." And Bear, still silent, still strong, stayed. They say the hardest part of love is not the loving itself, but the letting go. And even though Grace had prepared herself for months, had watched Bear slow down with each passing season, had adjusted his food, carried him up the stairs when the joints in his back legs began to stiffen, and placed soft rugs across every hardwood floor so he could rest without slipping. Nothing could prepare her for the morning he didn't rise, not right away, not like before, because that morning, quiet, sunlit, peaceful, started like all the others, with Sophie's bare feet padding into the living room and the smell of toast curling from the kitchen. But when Sophie reached the corner where Bear always lay curled beneath the window, where the light always caught in his eyes and the teddy, Bear named Hope rested beside his paws. She paused, tilted her head, and whispered, "Mom, something's different." And Grace, already halfway to the door, turned, holding her breath as she stepped into the room, and she knew, the moment she saw him, that something had shifted, that this was not sleep, but something quieter, something deeper, because Bear wasn't gone, not entirely, but his breathing was slower, more labored, like his body had already started saying goodbye, even though his heart hadn't yet. And she knelt beside him, whispering his name, stroking his ears, calling softly for Sophie to bring water. And Bear opened his eyes, just barely, looked at them both, and with the last strength he had, nudged the teddy bear toward Sophie's lap, like he was passing on something sacred, and then rested his head again with the kind of surrender that only comes when love is certain. And they stayed with him the whole day. No school, no work, no distractions, just a mother and daughter beside the dog who had saved their lives, whispering stories, brushing his fur, singing softly. And when the sun finally dipped behind the hills and the sky turned lavender and gold, Bear took one last breath, deep and soft, and let go, not with pain, not with struggle, but with peace. And Sophie whispered through her tears, "Thank you for staying." And Grace kissed the top of his head and said, "You're free now and outside." The wind carried the chimes from their new porch, a gentle echo of the past and the whole town seemed to know without being told, because by morning, flowers appeared on their doorstep. Small handwritten cards slipped under the door, stuffed animals placed on the sidewalk with notes that read "Forever brave" and "Thank you, Bear and the vet." I'd become part of the family by now, came by and sat with them in silence, helping them carry Bear one last time, wrapped in the same blanket that had once warmed him after the fire. And they buried him under the willow tree at the edge of their rebuilt backyard, the place where Sophie had planted wildflowers and Grace had strung soft white lights in the branches. And the small wooden marker they placed read only one word: family. And from that day on, Bear wasn't gone, not really, because he was everywhere. In the pawprint Sophie made with ink and pressed into a frame in the stories she shared. At school, when kids were scared or sad, in the way Grace started a local volunteer group called Bear's Helpers that rebuilt houses for families who had lost their homes to fire, flood, or grief, and every time they finished a home, they left a small golden tag on the front doorknob that read, "You are safe," and people cried when they found them, not knowing the full story, but feeling its weight. And a year later, on the anniversary of Bear's passing, the mayor declared March 14th Bear Day, a town-wide moment to celebrate kindness, loyalty, and love. And on that first Bear Day, Sophie stood on the library steps, holding the same teddy bear Bear had saved from the fire, and said to the crowd, "He wasn't just our dog, he was all of ours." And people clapped and wiped their cheeks. And every child who came brought their favorite stuffed animal and laid them gently on the grass around Bear's tree, like offerings to the kind of love that doesn't die. And even now, years later, people still come to visit, not to cry, but to remember, to sit quietly and thank the universe for one dog who taught them that courage doesn't bark loudly. It moves in silence, into fire, for love, and stays. So if you've ever lost someone you loved, if you've ever felt like the world was too broken, too cruel, too unfair, I hope you remember Bear. I hope you remember what he did and why he did it, not because anyone told him to, but because something deep inside him knew what mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn from that, to listen more, to act without fear, to stay when it's hard, and to carry what we love through the fire and back again. Because love, real love, doesn't run away, it runs in. And if you're still here, still watching, still feeling, we want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? If you have a dog, what's their name? And what have they done, big or small, to show you they love you? Because we want to hear it. We want to know. Because Bear's story isn't just ours. It's yours too. And maybe if we all tell these stories, if we all remember, we can build a world that's a little softer, a little kinder, and a lot more brave, one pawprint at a time.